Welcome to Season 5, Episode 3 of CSS Breakdown, Book by Book. In this chapter of Andrew Haywood's Political Theory, an introduction, we unravel three of the most contested and foundational ideas in political theory: politics, government, and the state. Now, if you've ever found yourself using these terms interchangeably, well, you're definitely not alone. But here on the deep dive, our mission is to cut through that everyday confusion. We're going to explore the surprising depth of these concepts and give you a real shortcut, sort of, to understanding why they're so fundamental yet so fiercely debated in the world of political thought.
Yeah, it really is fascinating how these words, they seem so simple, don't they? But they actually unlock these distinct and often conflicting ideas about how societies are organized and, how power truly operates. Today, we're going to tackle some pretty big questions, ones that challenge our everyday assumptions. Like, for example, is politics just what happens in parliaments and elections, or does it actually play out in our schools, our workplaces, maybe even our own homes? And do we really need government for an orderly society? And if government is just one piece, what exactly is the state? That overarching thing that seems to have the final say.
Okay, let's unpack that first big question then. What is politics? It's a term we throw around constantly, but as our source material immediately points out, there are almost as many definitions of politics as there are authorities willing to offer an opinion. Just think about that for a second. Why is something so central to our lives so hard to pin down?
It's a great starting point, actually, because it highlights that politics isn't some fixed thing. It's an activity. It's something people do. And it always involves interaction. It's inherently social, right? Not something you do alone.
Yeah.
And crucially, it seems to arise from diversity and conflict.
Right. If we all agreed, no politics needed.
Exactly. If everyone agreed on everything, there'd be no need for politics. So at its core, politics is about the collective search for ways to resolve those conflicts, or at least manage them, and make decisions together.
So we're talking about managing disagreement in a group. Makes sense. Now, one of the oldest ways, maybe the most classic way, to think about politics connects it directly to formal power.
Precisely. This is often called the art of government. It takes us all the way back to ancient Greece, to the word polis, which meant city-state. For the Greeks, politics was simply what concerns the polis. Over time, this kind of evolved to mean what concerns the state.
Okay.
So in this, quite narrow view, politics is confined to the formal institutions of government cabinet meetings, legislative debates, the formal processes of making laws. It's what politicians, civil servants, lobbyists, that sort of group, what they do. The American political scientist David Easton, he famously captured this by defining politics as the authoritative allocation of values.
Authoritative allocation of values. Okay, that's a bit academic sounding. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Think of it like this: making formal, binding decisions for a whole society. Decisions about, who gets what, who pays for what, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and they're binding because they come from a recognized authority, like a government.
Got it. So the government says, this is a rule, and that's that.
Pretty much. And within this view, politics is often seen as the art of the possible. It's about rational debate, negotiation, compromise. For thinkers like Bernard Crick, in his book In Defense of Politics, politics is really about choosing conciliation over violence or coercion. It's the messy, maybe, but essential work of finding common ground, not chasing some perfect utopia.
That sounds almost, well, noble in a way. But I think for a lot of us, maybe most of us, the word politics has a much more negative ring to it, doesn't it? We tend to associate it with deception, dishonesty, even outright corruption. And it's not hard to see why, really, given some of the headlines. We even have terms like Machiavellian, right? From Niccolo Machiavelli, describing cunning and manipulation in power. It's why that famous saying by Lord Acton, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely, it still resonates so strongly, especially for people who worry about unchecked power.
And that very worry, that concern about power, it leads us naturally into a broader understanding of politics, thinking of it as public affairs. Here, politics expands beyond just the formal government buildings and includes the entire realm of public life, but it still draws a fairly clear line between what's public and what's private.
Okay, so broader than just government, but not everything.
Exactly. Aristotle was a big champion of this view. He famously stated, "Man is by nature a political animal." For him, engaging in public life in the polis was essential for human flourishing, for achieving the good life. But it's important to note, even for Aristotle, the private realm, the family, the household, that wasn't considered political.
So it's public life, but still not all of life. It's not your personal choices necessarily or your family dynamics.
Right. This view emphasizes a traditional split. You've got the state, on one hand, public institutions like government, courts, police, funded by taxes. And then you have society on the other, private, autonomous groups like families, businesses, clubs, funded by individual interests. In this framework, politics is limited to those state activities. It keeps economic life, social life, domestic life separate. And many conservative and liberal thinkers, they prefer this limited view. Why? Because they believe it protects individual liberty and privacy from government overreach.
That makes a lot of sense. You want a sphere of life that's your own, right, where the government isn't constantly interfering. But this is also where we run into that really powerful slogan, isn't it? The personal is the political. This really throws a wrench into those neat boundaries.
Oh, it absolutely does. Because while some thinkers, like Hannah Arendt, saw politics as this noble public activity, giving meaning to life, celebrating participation, well, other perspectives argue that the public-private divide itself is political. Socialists, for instance, they look at private economic life and see profound injustice and inequality. So they argue the state should expand its role to fix these issues. Politics becomes the tool for achieving economic fairness for them.
So using the state to correct private wrongs?
Exactly. And then at the very extreme, you have something like fascism, which completely rejected any private sphere. Mussolini's slogan, right? Everything for the state, nothing against the state, nothing outside the state, total control.
Wow. Okay, so we've gone from politics as just government to politics as public life, and now it sounds like politics could be everywhere. This feels like the most radical shift yet.
It really is. This third conception sees politics as a distinctive social activity that, and this is a quote from Adrian Leftwich, pervades every corner of human existence. This perspective suggests politics isn't just about formal rules or public debates. It fundamentally arises from scarcity. Think about it. Our human needs and desires might feel infinite, but resources, whether it's money, power, status, even attention, they're always limited.
Always a competition.
Always. So politics becomes any activity where conflict over how to allocate those limited resources takes place. And crucially, this view means politics can include not just rational debate, but also threats, intimidation, maybe even violence. It connects to what Clausewitz famously said, war is nothing more than the continuation of politics by other means.
So stripping it right back, politics is simply about power. Who gets what, when, and how. That's the famous phrase, isn't it? Harold Lasswell.
Precisely. That encapsulates it perfectly. And this really expansive view has been championed by groups like Marxists and, as you mentioned, radical feminists. For Marxists, politics, law, culture, what they call the superstructure, are deeply rooted in the economic base of society, where class struggle is the driving force. So the economic conditions fundamentally shape political power. Lenin even declared, politics is the most concentrated expression of economics.
Meaning economics comes first?
In their view, yes. And in a truly classless communist society, Marxists believe politics as we know it, this struggle over resources and power, would simply wither away, cease to exist.
And that radical feminists really took this politics is everywhere idea and ran with it, particularly with the personal is the political. That must have caused quite a stir, especially for traditional liberals.
It certainly did, and still does. Kate Millett, for instance, defined politics broadly as power-structured relationships. The argument is that wherever power and resources are unequally distributed, whether that's in a government, a multinational corporation, a workplace, or even within a family, politics is happening. So relationships between partners or parents and children, they're seen as potentially just as political as relationships between employers and employees or citizens and the state.
Wow.
Yeah. And for liberal thinkers, this expansion into the private sphere, it raises serious alarms about individual privacy and autonomy. It forces us all to ask where, if anywhere, should we draw the line? Where does politics stop?
That is a huge question. And it really shows why just defining politics is so incredibly contested. Okay, let's shift gears slightly to our second core concept, government. Now, whether you think politics is everywhere or just in specific institutions, government is undeniably central to the discussion. In its broadest sense, sure, to govern just means to rule or control like parents govern a household, or a teacher governs a classroom. But we usually mean the formal institutional processes that maintain public order and allow for collective action in a society.
Right. And all governments, pretty much regardless of their form, they perform three basic functions. They make laws or rules, that's legislation.
Yeah.
They implement or enforce those laws, that's execution.
Right, the executive branch.
And they interpret the laws and settle disputes, that's adjudication.
Legislation, execution, adjudication, the classic separation of powers idea, often.
Exactly. Now, what's maybe remarkable is the near universal agreement that some form of government is necessary. Most people just assume that without it, society would descend into chaos. This is really central to those classic social contract theories. Thomas Hobbes, in his famous book Leviathan, painted that incredibly grim picture of a state of nature without government, describing life as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Doesn't sound appealing.
Not at all. And he argued that rational individuals would willingly give up some of their natural freedom to an absolute sovereign, a government, in exchange for basic order and security. It's a pretty pessimistic view of human nature, fundamentally.
Very much so. It basically sounds like government is just a necessary evil there to keep us from tearing each other apart.
That's one powerful way to look at it, yes. A defense against evil, you could say. But there's an older tradition, going back to Aristotle and later Thomas Aquinas, that sees government differently. They viewed it as intrinsically good, not just a necessary evil. For them, its purpose is to promote the good life, to help people cooperate for mutual benefit, not just prevent harm. They'd argue government would be necessary even if humans were angels, basically.
Interesting contrast. But then you have the anarchists, right? They challenge this whole necessity argument head on. Anarchy literally means without rule.
Exactly. Anarchists believe government is both unnecessary and fundamentally evil, or at least harmful. They tend to have a much more optimistic view of human nature, arguing people are capable of self-governance, cooperation, and that a natural, spontaneous social harmony would emerge without state coercion. They often see government not as the solution, but as the cause of conflict, inequality, and repression.
It's a challenging idea, especially when you think about applying it to huge, complex modern societies. How would that work without some central authority?
That's the perennial question for anarchism, isn't it? How do you scale up those principles? But given these debates about whether we even need government, how do political theorists then try to categorize the different types of governments that exist? Aristotle, again, offered one of the first classifications. He asked two simple questions. Who rules? Is it one person, a few, or the many? And secondly, who benefits? Do they rule for the common good or just for themselves?
Right, so he had categories like monarchy versus tyranny, aristocracy versus oligarchy.
Precisely. Monarchy was ruled by one for the good of all. Tyranny was ruled by one for their own benefit. Aristocracy was ruled by a virtuous few. Oligarchy was ruled by a wealthy few in their own interest. And he contrasted polity rule by the many for the common good with democracy, which he actually saw as a perverted form, mob rule serving the poor.
Interesting that he saw democracy negatively back then.
Yeah, his preference was actually for a polity, a kind of mixed constitution, ideally balanced by the middle classes, avoiding the extremes. But obviously, modern government is vastly more complex than those ancient categories allow for.
Absolutely. We can't just slap those labels on today's systems.
No, we really can't. Today, what we often talk about are liberal democracies, which are kind of the dominant model in, well, many parts of the world. They're liberal because they emphasize limited government, constitutional rules, checks and balances, all designed to protect individual freedoms. And they're democratic because, in theory at least, power ultimately rests with the people, expressed through regular elections, representation, and crucially, respect for political rights like free speech and association. They thrive on political pluralism, the idea that lots of different parties and ideas can openly compete.
Okay, that sounds familiar. But even within liberal democracies, there are variations, right? Parliamentary versus presidential systems, for example.
Huge variations. And beyond that Western model, you have all sorts of other systems. New democracies emerging from communism, often with flaws. East Asian models prioritizing economic growth and strong government, maybe influenced by Confucian values. Islamic systems ranging from fundamentalist theocracies to more guided democracies, and unfortunately still military governments or juntas in some places.
It's a very diverse picture, which actually leads nicely into this idea of moving from government to governance. What's that shift about?
That's a really important point in contemporary political science. The focus has shifted somewhat from looking only at the fixed structures of government, the institutions, to examining the broader processes of governance. Governance refers to the various ways social life is coordinated and regulated. Government is just one mechanism, one institution involved in governance.
So governance is bigger than government.
Much bigger. It includes things like markets coordinating economic activity, networks of NGOs or community groups managing local issues, international agreements, setting rules. You can even talk about governance without government in some contexts. Think about multi-level governance power shifting down to regions or cities through devolution, but also up to international bodies like the EU or the UN.
And global governance, right. Managing global issues like climate change or pandemics without a world government.
Exactly. And that's hugely debated. Is global governance a good thing, a step towards cooperation, the liberal view, or is it a dangerous illusion that ignores the reality of state power, the realist view? This links to another concept, the political system. Instead of just looking at institutions, systems analysis, pioneered by David Easton again, views politics as an organized or complex whole of interrelated parts. It includes all the processes that link the government and the governed.
Okay, how does that work? Like inputs and outputs?
Precisely. Easton's model talks about inputs flowing into the political system. These are things like demands from citizens, better health care, lower taxes, and supports, like patriotism or willingness to obey laws. The system then processes these inputs and converts them into outputs, decisions, laws, policies. These outputs then generate feedback, which influences future inputs.
And the system stays stable if the outputs generally satisfy the inputs.
That's the idea. Stability depends on maintaining that balance. It helps explain, perhaps, why liberal democracies tend to be more stable. They have lots of channels for demands, elections, interest groups, free press, and ways to generate support. Authoritarian regimes might suppress demands, which can lead to instability in the long run if discontent builds up. Though critics argue this model has its own biases, often favoring the status quo.
Fascinating. Okay, this brings us logically to our final core concept, the state. Now, you said earlier it's often used interchangeably with government, but our source makes a really critical distinction here. The modern state is something larger, more powerful, and actually emerged later in history, maybe around the 15th or 16th centuries. Government, you said, is part of the state, but the state is the ultimate authority, the whole structure.
Yes, that distinction is absolutely crucial for understanding modern politics. So, what defines the state? It's a set of public institutions, sure, but fundamentally it's a political association that claims sovereign jurisdiction within defined territorial borders. And sovereignty is the absolute key feature here. It means absolute and unrestricted power, theoretically, standing above all other groups and associations within its territory.
The ultimate boss, basically.
You could say that. Think of Hobbes's image of the state as Leviathan, that mighty all-encompassing power needed to prevent chaos. Max Weber added another critical layer, arguing the state holds the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory.
Right, you mentioned that, meaning only the state can legitimately use force, police, courts, military to enforce its will.
Exactly. If anyone else uses force without state sanction, it's considered illegitimate, criminal. This is what distinguishes a functioning modern state from, say, feudal times with overlapping authorities, or from a situation of state collapse or civil war, where that monopoly on force breaks down.
Okay. And this authority is universal within its borders.
Right.
Yeah, and compulsory.
Yes. Everyone within the state's territory is subject to its authority, usually with very little choice in the matter. And ultimately, that authority is backed by coercion, the state's capacity to punish those who disobey its laws.
Now, you mentioned earlier that this distinction between the state and the government of the day is vital for constitutional rule. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. It's fundamental to limiting power. The idea is that the state represents society's permanent, enduring interests, things like maintaining order, stability, national security. The government, on the other hand, is temporary. It consists of the specific politicians currently in power, influenced by their partisan interests and ideologies. So, liberal democracies try very hard to maintain a clear divide, for example, having a politically neutral civil service, an independent judiciary, a professional military loyal to the Constitution, not the ruling party. This is meant to prevent the government of the day from seizing the state's immense power for its own narrow, partisan goals, which is a pathway to dictatorship.
Though you also said that line often gets blurred in practice.
It does. It's a constant tension. But the principle is crucial. And just like with politics and government, the state itself is, as Haywood puts it, an essentially contested concept. There are wildly different theories about what the state truly is, whose interests it represents, and how its power operates.
Okay, let's hear about some of those competing theories.
Well, the mainstream liberal view, drawing from those social contract ideas, tends to see the state as a neutral arbiter, like an umpire in a game, acting impartially in the common good or public interest, balancing the competing claims of different groups and individuals in society.
The fair referee model?
Exactly. But not everyone buys that. Pluralist theories agree power is dispersed among many competing groups, businesses, unions, environmental groups, etc. And they see government as largely responsive to the pressures these groups exert, acting as a neutral broker between them.
Okay, still fairly neutral.
But then you get neo-pluralists, thinkers like Galbraith or Lindblom, who offer a sharp critique. They say, hang on, not all groups are equal. They argue that business interests, because of their vital role in the economy and their vast resources, often wield disproportionate influence over government, making it not so neutral after all.
So business gets a special hearing.
That's the argument. Then, swinging in a different direction, you have the new right. They have a strong antipathy towards the state, or at least big government. They view the state not as neutral, but often as a parasitic growth that interferes with the free market and individual liberty. They talk about the nanny state meddling in people's lives, or the Leviathan state crushing freedom. They criticize the self-interest of bureaucrats, as Niskanen argued, and the way party competition can lead to irresponsible spending promises.
So they want to shrink the state drastically. What about theories that see power as concentrated, not dispersed?
Right. Those are the elitist theories. They argue that behind the facade of democratic competition, real power is concentrated in the hands of a small, cohesive, ruling elite. Joseph Schumpeter, for example, had this idea of democratic elitism. Citizens can choose which elite governs them in elections, but they can't escape the fact that an elite will rule.
So democracy is just choosing your elite.
In that view, yes. More radical elitists, like C. Wright Mills in the U.S., went further. He famously pointed to the power of what he called the military-industrial complex, a tight network of military leaders, defense contractors, and politicians as the real center of power, operating largely outside democratic control.
Okay, that's a powerful critique. How does the Marxist perspective view the state?
Marxists offer perhaps the most fundamental challenge to the neutral state idea. They see the state as fundamentally linked to the economic structure, specifically the class system. Marx and Engels famously called the state a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. Their core argument is that the state emerges to protect private property and maintain the domination of the ruling capitalist class over the working class. It's an instrument of class oppression.
So not neutral at all, but serving one specific class.
Exactly. Yeah. Although later Marxists like Nikos Poulantzas developed the idea of relative autonomy. They suggested the state isn't always just a simple tool of the capitalists. It can sometimes seem to act independently, maybe implementing welfare reforms or regulating businesses. But, they argue, these actions ultimately serve the long-term interests of capitalism by managing social tensions and maintaining stability, even if it means short-term concessions.
So it can adapt, but its fundamental purpose remains the same in their view. And finally, the anarchists again. They must have the most radical condemnation of the state.
Oh, absolutely. They see the state not just as biased or flawed, but as intrinsically oppressive and a concentrated form of evil, as Mikhail Bakunin vividly put it. It's inherently based on coercion and hierarchy. Anarcho-capitalists like Murray Rothbard might dismiss the state simply as a criminal band engaged in theft through taxation. And more contemporary anarchists like Murray Bookchin view the state as more than just institutions. It's an instilled mentality for ordering reality based on domination, which is ultimately corrupting for everyone involved.
Wow. Okay, so these incredibly different theories about what the state is lead to equally different ideas about what its proper role should be, right?
Precisely. At one end of the spectrum, you have the classical liberals and modern libertarians advocating for a minimal state, often called the night watchman state, borrowing from Locke. Here, the state's functions are strictly limited to the bare essentials, maintaining domestic order, police, courts, enforcing contracts, and providing defense against external attack. Everything else, the economy, welfare, education, should be left to individuals, families, private businesses, and voluntary associations. This view has seen a significant resurgence since the 1980s.
The get government off our backs idea.
Essentially, yes. But for much of the 20th century, the dominant trend, certainly in the West, was towards an expanding state, a much more interventionist role. This was supported by various ideologies, social democrats, modern liberals, even some paternalistic conservatives.
And what drove that expansion? What did the bigger state do?
Well, it took two main forms. First, the state became a major provider of welfare. It created social safety nets, pensions, unemployment benefits, public health care, education aiming to reduce poverty, inequality, and provide security from cradle to grave in some cases. The scale varied, from basic safety nets to comprehensive systems aiming for significant redistribution.
Okay, the welfare state.
And second, the state became heavily involved in economic management. Following the Great Depression and World War II, Keynesian ideas became dominant. Governments used fiscal policy, spending and taxes, and sometimes monetary policy to manage the economy, aiming for full employment and stable growth. In many countries, this also involved nationalizing key industries, energy, transport, communications, creating so-called mixed economies with significant public sectors alongside private ones.
So a much bigger footprint in society and the economy. And then you have the most extreme forms of state control.
Right. At the far end, you find orthodox communist states, particularly in the 20th century, which aimed for centrally planned economies. They essentially abolished private enterprise and transferred control of the entire economy to the state apparatus. And even more extreme are totalitarian states, think Nazi Germany or Stalin's Soviet Union. These regimes sought total control over every aspect of human existence. The economy, education, culture, art, family life, even private thoughts. They aimed to abolish civil society entirely, merging the individual completely into the state.
It's chilling, so all-encompassing that some argue it's paradoxically the death of politics?
Exactly. Because politics, in most senses we've discussed, relies on some degree of diversity, disagreement, individual or group autonomy. Totalitarianism seeks to extinguish all of that, replacing it with monolithic control.
So wrapping this all up, it's clear that these three concepts, politics, government, and the state, their definitions are far from settled, aren't they? They're deeply interwoven with different philosophical views, different historical experiences, and ongoing struggles over power.
Absolutely. They are fundamentally contested. And understanding why they're contested, understanding the different ways people define them, is absolutely crucial for making sense of the political world around us. Because how you define these terms profoundly shapes what you see as legitimate, what you see as problematic, and what you believe is truly possible in human society.
And that leads us perfectly into our provocative thought for you today. If politics is truly about, as some of those radical theories suggest, power-structured relationships that pervade every corner of human existence, well, what implications does that have for how you view your own personal life, your professional life? It really challenges us, doesn't it, to look beyond just the ballot box and the official institutions and to perhaps see where the political truly lies, maybe even in places we never, ever considered before. Something to think about.